We appreciate you coming.
Thank you. So I introduced myself last time. Just to recap quickly. Hello again. My name is Weissman. I still work with Global Justice for Animals and the Environment. So Global Justice for Animals and the Environment is an organization that works on opposing the impact or fighting the impacts of free trade policy on animals. These are some of our principles. We are an animal rights organization. Our ideas are premised on the idea that animals have an equal right to their lives and liberty, to their autonomy and self-determination, and that on that basis we're committed to the idea of anti-speciesism, the idea of rejecting the idea that human life comes before other life, other sentient beings. We support protecting ecosystems and defending biodiversity. The survival of life on this planet requires the diversity of life on this planet, and every living thing requires a habitat within which to live. So a fundamental aspect of defending the rights of animals is defending the environment within which they live. We believe that one of the most important ways to achieve this is through sustainable living, through reducing, as a society, our impact on the planet, and shifting away from a globalized economy towards a localized economy. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard about things about local food and trying to reduce our environmental impact through, instead of getting products shipped across the world, getting things that are grown close to home. We think that's an idea that we need to embrace as a society overall, because we're consuming vast resources just to ship things from one place to another when we could be creating or growing those same things close to home. We reject, on the other hand, we reject globalism or globalization, which is the idea that we should be part of, or economic globalization, the idea that we should be part of a completely globalized economy, that that instead of that we should be eating apples from Chile instead of from New York, and that everything should be about where things can be produced the cheapest, and which often means produced the cheapest because workers are paid less or because less environmental laws are respected. And as part of that, we reject what's called the neoliberal economic model, which is, neoliberalism includes privatizing government resources, the things that people have paid with for their tax dollars. So things like, you've heard the news about ideas about privatizing Social Security, which means taking what people have worked for and putting it in the hands of private companies to make profits off of. And it also means deregulation, getting rid of those pesky environmental laws and animal protection laws that make corporations lose money, and also opening markets between countries, getting rid of trade barriers that sometimes cost corporations profits by protecting local farmers, protecting the environment. Basically doing a lot of things that most of us, I think, would think are good ideas, but make executives make less than $100 million a year, perhaps, and corporations a few less billion. We support environmental justice. Environmental justice is the idea. Does anyone know this term? Okay. Environmental justice is the idea that protecting the environment is a social justice issue, because when we look at the communities that are most impacted by environmental abuses, they tend to be communities of color. They tend to be low-income communities. They tend to very often urban communities of color, very often indigenous communities who are facing issues like extraction of natural resources from their land. And these are communities that very often don't have the political power and influence and wealth to defend themselves in the same way that more politically influential and economically well-off and powerful communities do. So corporations basically prey on the weak. And we can say the same thing about animals. Just as many communities have less voice, animals have the least voice of all. So when corporations log a forest or drill for oil and cause oil spills in where animals live, the last thing considered is how this affects animals. We perhaps consider animal species because we see our survival as connected to biodiversity, but the welfare of individual animals impacted is almost never a consideration. Finally, one of our most important principles is solidarity with indigenous communities. Just as I was saying before, indigenous communities are very often hardest hit by what fuels our entire industrial civilization, the quest for oil, natural gas, coal, etc., and also mining for things that are just about pure greed like gold. And so these communities are most heavily impacted, but also very often on the front lines of defending the earth, not only because it relates to their survival, but also because many of them have a very deep spiritual connection to the idea that it is their responsibility to protect and honor the planet, something that unfortunately is not as deeply felt in our culture, the dominant culture of Western civilization. So quickly, what are free trade agreements? They deal with a lot more than trading, with trading commodities between nations. They also deal with tariffs. The most obvious is tariffs and quotas. How many of a certain thing you're allowed to send to what country, how much of a tariff is put on it, meaning how much extra price is put on it once it gets imported, so that a country can try to control how much local product is bought versus product from another country. Free trade agreements try to eliminate tariffs and eliminate quotas, open up the market so there's no regulation. They also contain investment rules, which are rules that give, in the form that we've seen them, they tend to give corporations the right to protect their investments by suing governments when governments get in the way of their profits. So, for example, if a government tries to enforce its environmental laws and it's going to mean a country is going to lose profits in the future, that corporation can sue the government for the money that they would lose based on what profits they might make in the future. And this has been used to knock down lots of environmental laws. Finally, they contain two other things: intellectual property rules. This is the aspect of free trade agreements that gives drug companies the right to get generic drugs off the market because they're losing money when people buy drugs they can actually afford. So a company like Pfizer will support a free trade agreement so they can go into a poor country and force the government to stop selling generic drugs. You know, a lot of people die. That's okay because it might interfere with profit. And finally, procurement rules. These are the rules that tell our government what our government is allowed to buy. So, in effect, the procurement rules of trade agreements say you cannot make your own rules about what you want to buy. If you want to say, we don't want to buy products that people are treated inhumanely for, that animals are treated inhumanely for, that the environment is damaged for, these are violations of the right to free trade. And so the government has to only look at what's the cheapest, not how things are made. How much? 3 minutes? Okay. So, that's okay. So we'll try to see if we can still do.
It's very good so far.
So we'll just skip a few things. Procurement rules we covered, state investor we covered, state-to-state challenges to non-tariff barriers to trade versus import bans on sustainable and inhumane products. So what this means is using generally the World Trade Organization, though sometimes other trade agreements, governments will go and sue other governments for trying to ban the importation of their product. So, for example, Europe tried to ban, Canada sued Europe for trying to ban furs cobbled steel jaw like coal traps, which are the device that Charles Darwin called the cruelest device ever invented by man. Canada right now is challenging the European Union's ban on seal fur, and Mexico at one point is currently challenging the U.S. ban on dolphin unsafe tuna. And there's cases and cases like this going back for the last 2 decades where all these really progressive laws to protect animals have been challenged at the World Trade Organization. Other things, let's see. Agricultural liberalization. Basically, by eliminating barriers to free trade, by eliminating the barriers to trade, and what it does is it keeps countries from protecting their own farmers. So the big corporate factory farms that get subsidies from our government in the form of cheap subsidized grain, and that can produce with an economics of scale that allows them to produce cheaper meat than can be produced in countries where farmers are still using traditional methods, now have the opportunity to go into other countries, flood their markets with our products, put their farmers out of business, and ensure that everyone is eating the most inhumanely produced and most environmentally destructive animal products produced. It's Monsanto, it's Smithfield, it's Cargill, it's really just the global concept of agribusiness over traditional agriculture. Transportation, one of the other problems is when we try to ship more things everywhere, we're committing to more roads, more fuel being burned, more animals being killed from roadkill, which may seem like a small thing, but if you actually look at the numbers of how many animals are actually killed every year on our roads, the numbers are staggering. The free trade agreements also allow facilitate live animal export. Some of the most inhumane things that happen to animals is how they're shipped from one place to another, packed. I mean, if you've seen pictures of factory farms, the shipping is actually even more intense. Okay, So we'll wrap up there.
Can you email this to us?
Yeah, I think so.
Great, I'm done.
If people have, do you want, if people want to email that, I can like that.
And Adam, now that you know how to come here, and what we can do, it was very gracious of you to offer to come back again. I'm sorry we were tight on presentations, but I teach this class every year.
Oh, wow.
And this is the first time I've had an activist school, and I would love to have you. Next time, I promise, I will block out a whole class period next fall. All right?
Well, thank you.
I'll get in touch with you, or you get in touch with me, and we'll have
great.
you come back, and you can do the whole presentation in one go. And maybe we can even get our act together to get permission for you to film and, use the venue if you want that. Okay?
That'll be great.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
And I see you brought some literature.
Yeah.
Looks as though if anybody's interested in picking up anything, you can just come by. And Siobhan, thank you again. Thank you for organizing this.
Sure.
And thank you for all the good presentations and everything.